Welcome to March and Women's History Month on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Ann Lloyd, and I am thrilled to be bringing you conversations with some amazing women who are talking about other amazing women as we remind ourselves that her story is part of our history. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Ann Lloyd, and I am here with a very special guest, Jackie Uí Chionna. She is the author of one of my new obsession books, Queen of Codes. I will tell you, I was at Bletchley Park, as some of you know, and perusing the bookshop, and this one just leapt out at me. So I am thrilled to have Jackie join us today. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast to chat with me today.
It's a pleasure, Caroline. I'm so looking forward to it.
Thank you. Well, tell me what brought you to history and social history, your particular areas of interest.
Yeah, well, I guess we're all marked by the people who raise us. And in my case, it was my dad who was the keen historian. Now, I should add, he wasn't an academic historian, Caroline. I mean, he's a man who, like many others, he left school at 13 and without any second level education, and went to work as was necessary in his family. But he always had this passion for history. And so when my sister and I were growing up, he worked Monday to Friday and worked very, very hard in the building industry. But on weekends, he was ours and we were his, and he wanted to share his passion for history with us. So every weekend, he would just take us off to museums, to, famous historical sites, to the houses of famous people, or my personal favorite, Kilmainham Jail in Dublin City, which is where it's no longer a jail, hasn't been for a long time, but it's where all of the leaders of the 1916 rising in Ireland and the War of Independence, etc., and lots before that were incarcerated. So it is oozing with history, and that was my favorite place. So I guess I was the only 8-year-old around who was saying, "Please, Dad, can we go to the jail this weekend?" I just loved it. It was it was like touching history, if you know what I mean. You're opening these creaky doors and you're thinking, imagining the people. So really that was it for me. I was completely hooked. There were always history books around the house. He would always shush us when something was on the radio. Listen to this. Shh. No, we have to stay quiet and listen. So I got my passion for history from my dad. I'm very proud of that fact, and I'm very grateful for it as well.
That is wonderful. And as you began to explore history on your own, what was really initially interesting to you and took you on the path you're on now?
Yeah, well, again, as I say, that was always my particular interest. But obviously, if
Mhm.
you do a history degree, and I did a
Mhm.
degree in history and English at University College Dublin, and I'm from Dublin, but now living in the west of Ireland in Galway. But I went to UCD to do my primary degree, and of course, you do all the normal courses in Irish and European and international history. But I was always drawn to the stories of the people,
Yeah.
everything from Napoleon to Julius Caesar to you name it, anybody and everybody involved. Where there was a biography to be read, I read it. And it was kind of interesting years later when I went to do my PhD and pick my PhD topic. My supervisor said, "So what are you going to do it on?" And I said, "Well, I'm interested in lots of different things." And he gave me a very good piece of advice. And he said, "No, you're not. You're interested in one thing. You need to figure that out. And what you do is you go home and you look at your bookshelves. You've got a bookshelf behind you there,
Yes, yes.
Caroline." And he says, "You look at the bookshelf, and when you take out of those books that you've bought, books that you had to buy because they were required reading for a course you were doing, and you just pick the books that you bought for the sheer pleasure of reading them, that's where your answer is." And sure enough, I went and I looked at my bookshelf. I thought he was completely crackpot. He wasn't getting this at all. He's nuts. What is he talking about? And there it was, biography, Nelson Mandela, Bonaparte, Queen Elizabeth, King Henry VIII. It was all biographies of Irish and international figures. And I thought, you're right. That's my thing. I'm a biographer. I'm a social historian. So that's where I went with the PhD.
Oh, that's great. It's wonderful to hear that. And for many of us, if we did that, if we looked at our bookshelves, look at what we buy for pleasure, that will tell us a lot about ourselves. And
Yeah.
I remember someone described my apartment once when I was younger, but it looked a lot like this. And she said, well, I went over to Carol Ann's and there were a lot of bookshelves, and I think there was a couch, but it was it was clear from the start. Yeah, so I understand that. Now, for this book, you bring us the story of Emily Anderson. And I love the way it begins because we sort of begin at the end, sort of a Mary Queen of Scots. And I'm going to mention Mary a couple of times because there's a
Sure.
lot of decoding here.
That's
But
for sure.
yeah, but we meet her at her funeral, and in some ways you would think this was, just a normal village funeral from a much loved older lady, but there are clues even there to the trained eye. So sort of take us through that and tell us a little bit about why you chose to introduce us to this wonderful character in
Yeah.
that way, because that was so interesting to me.
Well, that's great, and it's so great that you should say that. I mean, I was thinking in straight lines. You start out when the person is born and etc. But this is a person nobody knew anything about, you know?
Yes.
So why would you be interested in somebody you know anything about? You've got to be intrigued by the story. So when I wrote the initial draft, I spoke to my agent and he said, you're not grabbing me here. And he said, and he asked exactly the same question that you had asked, which was, how did you first realize, whoa, there's something here? And it was in interviewing one of Emily Anderson's neighbors from Hampstead in London, a very nice, beautiful, leafy suburb that she spent most of her adult life living in. And she was a very ordinary lady. She didn't suspect anything about her next door neighbor other than that she worked for the Foreign Office, in inverted commas. She was polite, well dressed, quiet, kept to herself, didn't involve herself in idle conversation. But she was able to tell me that at her funeral, the church was packed to capacity. There was magnificent music played and sung at the funeral. But she also said to me, oh, and by the way, on her coffin were these two velvet lined boxes, and they had medals in them. And she didn't know what those medals were, but of course I knew what they were. And she said, and we were just intrigued. Why has this woman got these medals on her coffin? And when I told my agent that, he said, that's it. That's the beginning of your book. That's what you got to put there. Tell that story, and then people were going to want to turn the page and find out what's going on here. So thankfully, that is the case. And you've just confirmed that for me. Thank you, Caroline.
Absolutely. I was hooked instantly. But I love the idea that one of her neighbors, and this is what's so interesting, you were able to talk to some of the people who knew her and
Yes.
could give you sort of the glimpse from the outside. And well, this was unusual, or this caught my eye, those two boxes, and the church being packed
Yes,
because it doesn't
absolutely.
line up with this quiet woman
No.
that she knew. So tell us a little bit about Emily and how she became who she ended up being.
Okay, so I mean, the lady, as I said, and you're quite right, most people didn't know. Even my own university, where she was the first professor of German appointed in 1917, what they knew about her were a very limited amount of things. They were proud of the fact that A, she was the first woman professor of German, and that was great. They knew that she was the daughter of the university president at that time and came from a family of very able and talented
Mhm.
academics. They also knew that she'd accomplished an extraordinary feat throughout her life in that she did two major translations of the letters of two major composers. So in 1938, she published the translated letters from German into English of the letters of Mozart and his family. Thousands and thousands of letters that she accumulated and translated and published in 3 volumes in 1938. She subsequently, after the war, the Second World War had finished, she did exactly the same thing for Beethoven. So she compiled all of these letters from archives all around the world in private collections, translated them into pure, clean English from the convoluted German translations that had existed, and published those in 3 volumes in 1961. So again, a phenomenal woman who had given up her post as a professor of German, as I've mentioned, then goes over to England, joins the Foreign Office, presumably translating speeches or writing speeches. And in her spare time translates the letters of Beethoven and Mozart. So much so straightforward. But what nobody realized was that this woman in 1917, when she had just months after she'd have been appointed to this position, was approached by British intelligence and asked would she join the war effort and basically become a code breaker, a military intelligence operative breaking international codes. And she said, okay, I'll do it for the duration of the war. And then I'll come back, I'll become a professor again. I'll go back to my life. But of course, she never went back to that life because it turned out that she had a natural, jaw-droppingly good talent for breaking codes, such that she became, and there's no exaggeration in saying this, Britain's top female code breaker through two world wars, World War One and World War Two, and the interwar period. So there's a whole secret life there, Caroline, that nobody knew about. And I didn't know about, not my university, none of her friends. Even people in the British Secret Service knew a certain amount about her, but not everything. So I really was digging into a very, very deep barrel, and I had no idea if I was going to find anything at the bottom of it. So it was a real challenge, but it was a challenge that I could not walk away from. From the very beginning, I just thought, no, I got to get to the bottom of this. It was such a journey, and I don't regret it for one iota of a second. It was just so brilliant and so fulfilling to finally bring her to public recognition.
Well, that is really extraordinary when you think how well she kept that secret. So that is quite extraordinary. So, what was it about her that first sparked your interest and got you started on this journey to the bottom of the barrel, as you say?
Yeah, well, again, people often ask me, how did you find Emily Anderson? And I always say the same thing, which is that I don't think I found her. I think she found me. And that's not a very academic or scholarly thing to say in many respects, but I say it because I mean it. Nobody should have found her. I shouldn't have found her. What I was doing at the time when I found the first letter related to her Secret Service work was finishing off another book, another biography I'd been doing on a Galway politician. And I was rummaging in this very boring file of governing body minutes. And I don't know if there are any academics out there, but the most boring thing in life is a governing body minute because it's professors whining about their pensions or their career promotion prospects or all of that sort of stuff. But in the middle of this file, there was a little flap, a hidden flap. And I was flicking over the pages when something caught my eye and I started poking around in this little flap inside this folder. And I found two letters. And the first letter was her resignation in 1918, where she said, I have been recruited for work with the Foreign Office in London. I'll be giving up my post as professor. So far, so straightforward. But there was a second letter, and that was the key. The second letter basically was written to her friend, who was the college registrar. He was a Catholic priest called Monsignor Hines, and she and he were great friends. And she wrote a second letter to him, basically to say, look, this is the official letter, but I wanted you, my friend, to know really the real reason why I'm going. And that's what she did. She wrote in that letter, I've been recruited for military intelligence work. I'm to be trained in London. I'm to be sent to the front in France. Don't tell anybody, but that's the real story. I just wanted you to know it. And I remember reading that letter and just sitting back and saying, what? She's a professor of German. She's a respectable daughter of the university president. Military intelligence work? Are you kidding me? So it was just jaw-dropping. And I thought, why does nobody know about this? And I thought maybe she's bluffing, maybe this is a fantasy. But there was enough of it that compelled me that I just thought, okay, I shouldn't have found this letter. Maybe there's a reason I did. Maybe I'll follow this beginning of this trail of breadcrumbs and hope the breadcrumbs increase as I go further down the line. Um, and that was where it started, really. I finished the book I was working on the Friday. And on the Monday, I was back in the archive and I'd started work on Emily Anderson. That's how keen I was to solve this mystery.
Oh, that's extraordinary. So, do you know, or can you explain? I mean, because you mentioned her mind to become the top code breaker in Britain.
Yes.
what kind of a mind would that be? I mean, it's just hard to even imagine sometimes when you think about these codes. How could, I mean, my mind wouldn't work that way. Well,
Yeah.
and do you think they noticed that straight away and that's why they went to her?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that you're absolutely right. That's exactly what it was. I think people, and there's a wonderful description of it by a guy called Ewing, and he was a naval intelligence guy, and he described the type of minds that it took to get these who lived in a state of perpetual brilliance, basically. That's what he says. Some people are good at breaking codes, some people are exceptionally good, some people live in this perpetual light of insight. And you spot them very quickly. And generally, they're people who have lots of sides of the brain working together at the same time. So when I learned a little bit about code breaking from professional code breakers, and I interviewed quite a few of them in doing this book, it was stunning to me. And they were basically making these points and saying, well, first of all, she's a linguist. She's really, really good at languages. So she's used to looking at similarities and patterns in languages, grammatical systems. Where's the verb? Where's the adverb? Where's the noun likely to appear in a sentence in Hungarian, in German, in whatever language? So she had that. She was naturally good at languages. She's the daughter of a physicist, a really good physicist. So she had very good mathematical brain as well, really good mathematical brain. And thirdly, she's really good pianist and adores music. So music is all about patterns and repetitions as well. That's how you play music. You look at the patterns and the repetitions and you have to respond to them. So if you could design a code breaker, it would be Emily Anderson because she's got all those sides of her brain working in cohort with each other at the same time. And she's also, and I think this is important, Caroline, her upbringing was such that because she was the daughter of the university president in a small Galway town, there weren't many people of her social status around her that she could play with because she's the top of the tree, really.
Mm.
And she was also a Presbyterian. Her family were Presbyterians in a predominantly Catholic Galway. So she's sort of isolated. She doesn't have many friends growing up. She more or less socializes with her three brothers and two sisters and her brother. She doesn't, so she's very self-contained. She's very resourceful, very not, I wouldn't say self-absorbed, but she has to live in her own company and be happy with that. And really, if you're going to break a code, you need to be in that zone. You need to be able to just completely focus on the task in hand. And that's exactly what she could do with this phenomenal natural ability that she had. There are several code breakers. The top three code breakers in the world, two of them were American, Agnes Meyer Driscoll and Elizabeth Friedman, and the third is Emily Anderson. So particularly during that interwar period, two American women who were extraordinary, and Emily Anderson. And there have been books written about both Friedman and Agnes Meyer Driscoll, quite rightly so, phenomenal code breakers, but not a word about Anderson until I started doing this research. So she succeeded where maybe they failed, and quite rightly, I'm delighted they did because I wouldn't have been able to learn about them. But she desired to be quiet. She took the Official Secrets Act, which committed you to 60 years of silence, and she never ever once broke that vow. She never ever spoke about that side of her work. And that to me is just extraordinary.
Do you think because she was not an American, maybe the American Act was different and that's why we knew more about the Americans? I mean, I'm just wondering about the
Yeah,
difference.
um, I think you're right there, certainly. But the British didn't really laud their code breakers, their female code breakers, and they were really paranoid about people breaking the vow of silence. I mean, Churchill said, for example, Winston Churchill about the women code breakers of Bletchley, and there
Mhm.
were 10,000 people at Bletchley, as you'll know, Caroline, 7,000 of whom were women. And not one of them, not one ever broke rank and spilled the beans. And Churchill called them the geese that laid the golden egg and never cackled. And it's a brilliant way to describe them. I think Myra Driscoll and Elizabeth Friedman, were famous because they were allowed to be famous, because they did such extraordinary work, and the Navy were proud of them, and the Army
Mm.
were proud of them, and they allowed people access to the records. Anderson was under the constraints of the Official Secrets Act in the UK. But secondly, and I do think this is an important point, if you think of what I said earlier about her real passion in life, which was the translation of the letters of
Mhm.
Beethoven and Mozart, to do that work meant going regularly to where those archives were. And that is in Austria, in Vienna, in Salzburg, in Bonn, in Berlin. She's traveling to all these places in Austria, Germany, and loads of other places around the world. She spent her time doing that. There is absolutely no way she could have done that if there was even a sniff of a suspicion that this woman is working for the British Secret Service. Not a hope. So, in order for her to do that work, she had to be what she appeared to be, which is a respectable, unmarried, middle-aged civil servant who tootles around with, speeches in the Foreign Office during the day, and then at night tootles around on her piano and does all this scholarly work. And it's so far so unspectacular. But had they known what they were dealing with, I think it would have been a very, very different story. But they never knew. They never, never, never knew. And if I could just go back to that point that you mentioned earlier, Caroline, about the
Mhm.
two awards on her coffin. Those two awards were really interesting because the first one was the OBE, the Order of the British Empire, which is one of the most senior awards you can get from the King or Queen of England. And she got that for her services in the Middle East in the Second World War, effectively demolishing the Italians in East Africa. That's what she did. And she got the OBE in 1943 while the war was still ongoing. So that's how important her contribution was. Most people had to wait till the war was over to get their awards. She got it in 1943. So she gets one significant award from the British for her work in demolishing the Italians in the East Africa campaign. And then flash forward to 1961, the German professor Heinrich Lübke presents her in person with an award for her work on the letters of Beethoven, not having the slightest idea that this is the woman who'd been spying on them through two world wars in the
Mhm.
interwar period. I don't know anybody who could have pulled that off except Emily Anderson. It's quite something.
Well, that is really interesting when you think of it that way, when you look at those two awards as pivotal points,
Yes,
that it is for spying on this country, and then this country also recognizes
I
you.
know. Yeah.
That's quite extraordinary. And it goes to her ability to show the part of herself that she wanted people to see and keep the other part secret.
That's
So,
exactly it. Exactly right.
oh, that's just amazing. So, in this work that she's doing, and it's very interesting, I'd like to point out to everyone, if you didn't pick up on it, these three code breakers are all three women. So we're looking at one, there are the others two Americans, but let's look at Emily as a woman in a world that was really,
Mhm.
that part of the world and that part of the war effort was run by men, but they are relying on her. How did she navigate that?
With difficulty is the simple answer,
Yeah.
Caroline. Excuse me. Obviously, during the war, both wars, First and Second World Wars, women were desperately needed because the men were at the front. And her talents were recognized in that regard. But certainly after the First World War ended, the plan was that most of them would go back to their daily lives, and they would leave their jobs for the men, except four women in the UK. Four women were picked, and they were told these women are exceptional. We can't do without them. We want to keep them. But they were offered less than half the wages of the men who were kept on. And they were not given what we would call a tenure track position, basically. They were employed on a sort of until we need you, we don't need you anymore basis. And they were expected to accept that. So, the men were getting something like £220 per annum. The women were offered 120. It was appalling. And then they weren't being given a proper career trajectory position. So Emily Anderson, all the women complained, but only Emily Anderson dug her heels in, and she played a really smart game. And she basically said to them, "Look, I've got a professorship in Galway. I'm going back there. If you want me to stay, make me an offer. And the people in the Foreign Office were saying, "Oh well, if that's her attitude, she can just go back to her professorship." But the guys in the in the Secret Service were saying, "No, this woman is too good. We cannot let her go. We got to make an accommodation for her." And eventually they did. But while they did, she kept a foot in both camps, and which I think is very clever of her. She taught in her university during the academic year. But academic holidays are quite long. So she had 2 weeks at Christmas, she had 2 weeks at Easter, and she had all of the summer, basically May, June, July, August, and was back in college in September. So she literally went and worked in the UK during the months that she wasn't actually teaching. And she kept a foot in both camps. And eventually, her bosses who knew her value and knew her work had said, please make her some sort of an offer. And they did. So she ended up getting a payment of 240 and they upped that then to 260. So she was pretty much on a par with her male officers. But also, they gave her the critical thing that she demanded, which was tenure track. She wanted the prospect of a career in this. She wasn't a woman who was going to get married and having kids. That was never on her agenda at all. This was her life, and she was going to spend her life. And so she wanted promotion. She wanted salary increases. She wanted natural increases and annuities in her salary. And she got it. So she became at one point, which again, people in the Foreign Office in the UK could not believe this. They didn't know it until I told them. She became the highest ranking woman in the British Civil Service at one point, and the best paid woman in the British Secret Service as a whole. Absolutely extraordinary, just because she wouldn't take no for an answer.
That is an extraordinary part of her that we would miss without this, right? So I really appreciate getting that part. So, in addition to these extraordinary skills, this is a woman who knows her worth and is willing to stand up and fight for herself, which is
Absolutely.
just a wonderful, wonderful thing to hear about.
Mm.
And it also gives us just a glimpse because sometimes I think we forget. And when I went to Bletchley, I learned more about it that after the First World War ended, everyone wasn't sent home. There was a need to continue this level of Secret Service work going forward. And so she was a part of that. So between the wars, what kind of work would she have been doing?
That's a great question, Caroline, and it really speaks to what it was that made her so special. Her particular forte, I mean, there's two types of intelligence. There's military intelligence. So that's listening in on the messages of the commanders and the generals and the politicians, commanding where our strategy is going to be. And that's pretty straightforward in the sense that it's troop movements and supply lines and all of that sort of stuff. The other type of intelligence is diplomatic intelligence. And that's what the embassies are saying to each other, basically, and politicians are saying to each other. And that was Emily Anderson's particular forte, because it's actually infinitely more complex than military intel. Because generally speaking, most of the diplomatic corps would have been educated to a very high standard. They would have been very cultured men, and it was mostly men
Mhm.
who was in that service. They would have known literature, music, art, Greek, Roman. They would have been able to, make references in their messages, the coded messages to poetry, to music, to art, to, all sorts of philosophies. And because Emily Anderson was also similarly of that from that background, that highly educated, cultured background, she was able to spot these. So because her forte was diplo, as it was known, diplomatic intelligence, she was probably the first to know because she worked specifically in Italian diplomatic section. She was head of Italian diplomatic section actually in within the British intelligence service. So that's a pretty senior role. And that meant she was probably the first person to know that Mussolini was cozying up to Hitler and what Mussolini was going to do for Hitler and what Hitler was going to do for Mussolini. And she was absolutely on top of that at the very, very beginning. And it's interesting when you referred to Bletchley, and when eventually they all had to decamp to Bletchley when the war
Mhm.
began. Emily was not in the first group to move to Bletchley. She was in the second. Not because she wasn't important, but because she was so important. Because at that point, it's critical to know, is Mussolini really going to throw his lot in with Hitler? Um, and she was listening in on all those messages. So she's the first person to know what's going on. And she's the one who says, no, we have a problem here. This is what's going down and we need to watch it. And so she went in the second. Once the war was declared, once Hitler made his move, she went down to Bletchley and established herself there. And actually, there was a funny thing. I don't know if you came across this, Caroline, when you visited Bletchley, but all of the operatives, like Anderson, would have been told they would have been given money for a train ticket. They would have been told to have a bag packed in case they needed to decamp very quickly. And the signal was that they would each get a phone call which said, Anti-Flo is unwell. And that was your code, okay? It's kicking off. We need to get to Bletchley. And she got that message, but she didn't need a train. She had a car. So she was one of the few people who drove there in her own car. So, um, it's an extraordinary story, I think, that her skill set had that longevity because of the fact that it was Diplo that she worked in primarily. But significantly, when she went to Cairo and the work for which she won her OBE, they needed military intelligence people, and she switched. She was able to switch from Diplo to military intel and did it spectacularly well. And that, and again, is just, it's like being able to drive on the left-hand side of the road and immediately switching to driving on the right. Not a problem to her. She was able to do that, but it was not unspectacular thing for her to do. But it really is an extraordinary testimony to just how talented she was and how determined she was.
Right. And, she certainly lived up to when she said, you need me and I'm worth this much money. And,
Yes,
it's a good
indeed.
thing. So I want to read just, there's several moments that jumped out at me. This is a little earlier than you mentioned 1943. This is 1941. But when we hear in just a few sentences the impact. So, by March 1941, Anderson's team had reconstructed the deciphering tables to the point that CIT could be fully exploited at the main point of interception. And, again,
I
this
know.
just took me back for a moment to the work I've done with Mary Queen of Scots and how they were intercepting messages and passing them to decipherers and Thomas Philippe and all of that. But that ability to see something and get it like that is
I know.
just extraordinary.
It sure is. And it was exceptional. I mean, there were some really fantastic code breakers at Bletchley and indeed during the interwar period, but none of them were as good as Anderson. And everybody knew that. When I started doing this research, um, somebody really within, a pretty senior person within the intelligence sector said to me, "Look, we make a lot of women who've been involved in this work, but nobody was better than Anderson. She was absolutely in a class of her own." And what you've read out there, Caroline, is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely indicative of that level of senior. For somebody to be able to literally at the point of impact be able to
Yes.
read this is just, I mean, and your listeners, may or may not know the kind of stuff that they would have been confronted with. But it's a sheet of groups of letters, 5 letters and numbers, which could be any language.
Mm-hmm.
The substitution could be in any level. So a B could be a Q and an R could be an S, and the following day a B could be a P and an R could be a Y. You don't know, and you have to step back at it and say, what am I looking at here? But when your eye is experienced and your mind is experienced, it's like doing all these multiple computations in your head. And because she'd started in 1917, by 1939, 40, 41, the period you're talking about, this is just bread and butter to her. She's just well used to it. She doesn't need to think about it too much. But there were some awful accounts, or younger men in particular, who thought of her as this wizened old spinster who was a bit crotchety, and they were very dismissive of her. Excuse me. And that really irritated me, I have to say. I don't know if you found it
Yes.
irritating,
Oh,
but
yes.
I thought, oh gosh, I'd like to slap you down. You are so not getting who this woman is and dismissive of her. Whereas she was streets ahead of any of these young guys, right to the end of her career, and was recognized as such. And actually, there's one point I just wanted to mention in relation to her career, Caroline, and as you say, she really had to fight her ground and fight her case. But she had a number of male superiors who actually did recognize her worth, you know? And foremost amongst those was Alistair Denniston, Commander Denniston, who was in charge, overall charge of Bletchley Park. It was his
Mhm.
concept. He was the genius behind it. Um, and he spotted her in 1919. He worked in naval intelligence and she'd worked in military, but he knew how good she was. And he said, I want her. She's one of the four I want. And she was the only one kept on as a code breaker. The other were kept on as translators. But throughout their careers, Denniston supported her, encouraged her. He was the one who recommended her for her OBE. And he himself was a phenomenal man until he was eventually sidelined, and Jumbo Travis took over as
Mhm.
leader at Bletchley. But they were tremendous friends, and the correspondence between them, particularly when Emily was in Cairo, it's amazingly warm and friendly, because they were colleagues of many, many years standing at this stage. But I would give him credit, and Freddie Jacob, who was the overall commander in terms of the Middle East, two men who saw her worth and very much respected her hugely for everything she was capable of and for her loyalty and the fact that she could have done anything else with her life. But she chose to do this. She chose to put herself on the front line in Cairo in 1941, from there to 43. She chose to put her face on the front line and put herself in danger. I mean, there was a
Yes.
point, where Rommel's tanks were 7 miles away, and she was there on the front line. So, I think there were men who did support her, but the younger generation just perceived her as this doddery old woman. So,
It's quite extraordinary to hear that, but fortunately, those who knew her worth. But I appreciate you mentioning that decision to go to the war, not to state, not that Bletchley Park couldn't have been bombed. And we all know there were dangers in England as well, and
sure.
throughout Britain, but to go there with
Yeah,
tanks 7 miles away, that level, not just of ability, but of devotion.
I quite agree. Yeah, yeah.
And
And
that's,
you also made a key point, about that CIT and how she
mhm,
was so good. She was able to spot, like literally instantaneously, she was able to
yes.
on the spot transcribe it. That's why she went, because she knew how pressing knowing intelligence about the Italians' intentions and their plans was. And
Mhm.
she knew that nobody was faster than her or her colleague Dorothy Brooks in cracking these codes. So she just said, send me there. She wasn't asked to go, even though they planned to ask her. But before they even asked, she said, I want to go. We're wasting time
Yes.
here getting bags of messages sent back to the UK. I need to be on the ground. Give me the transcripts and I'll crack them. And so that took a lot of dedication and guts, pure guts, to put herself and the journey again in the book. I did account for the journey to Cairo in the book because of the German occupied parts of Africa, North Africa. They took a boat from Liverpool in the UK down to the Cape of Africa, basically to Cape Town, and literally then trained and planed and automobiled it all the way through the whole of Africa to get to Cairo. It's insane. Lots of dangers on the way, but they got there. They stayed for 3 years and they effectively knocked the Italians out of the war. And that is the reason she was given that award in 1943. And she absolutely richly deserved it.
Absolutely. And when you think of that, she willingly went to a very dangerous place and put herself, and then did all that she was expected. I mean, even exceeded expectations of
Yeah.
her work, which were so high because she was the person
Mm.
who could just spot it and on the spot. So it is an extraordinary story. Now,
Yes, it is.
as exciting as that is, I do want to spend a moment talking about her other great love and career, the music,
Yes.
because it's fascinating. And I feel like they lean into each other, as you say, kept the secret so she could do this research. But the music and the math all seems to have helped the brain work the way it does. So let's talk a little bit about the music
Yeah.
and how much that fueled her life and was such a love for her.
I mean, she said at one point, when she got into an argument with Commander Denniston at Bletchley, we were told about this by John Tiltman, who's a very senior figure in US intelligence. And Tiltman said, she said to Denniston, "You don't seem to realize, Commander Denniston, that my real work starts when I leave here." So she's basically saying, yeah, the code breaking is important, but really, I want to get back to my letters of Beethoven. And we have an amazing account of her from one of these young guys who's quite disrespectful towards Anderson, thinking that she was just this older figure treated with a little bit too much courtesy. He didn't rate her very highly. But he says in his rather, sour account of her, when there was nothing to her liking coming in on the code breaking front, she took from her drawer under her desk her biography of Beethoven, which later became a classic. And when I read that, I remember thinking, good Lord, this is astonishing. She's at the height of British intelligence, at the height of the war. And when there's nothing for her to do, she's working on Beethoven letters, not a biography. He was wrong in
He
that
was
regard. But she was transcribing, the letters of Germany's probably greatest composer, if not the world's greatest composer. I leave that to the music scholars out there to argue. But she was passionate about Beethoven. She loved Mozart. She loved to play Mozart.
Mhm.
That was her favorite composer to play. And she was a fine pianist, a really fine pianist. But Beethoven, I think his life, his struggles, the issues with his deafness, the turmoil and personal traumas in his life, I think she related to that in a way that, and it's again, this is another non-scholarly comment. I think she was almost living vicariously through him because of the quiet, sort of restricted life she lived. Living through him via his letters was a way of maybe experiencing life in a broader and maybe more multicolored way. But she adored Beethoven's music, and her letters and translations are so sensitive and brilliant. But she also thoroughly enjoyed her network of friends that she met in musicology. The collectors, the musicians, the opera singers, performers, the antiquarian dealers who were dealing in
Mhm.
these letters. She became friends with so many of them, and helped so many of them actually. During the war, certainly, she looked after a lot of Jewish book dealers who'd have to get out of Germany, under severe pressure, and she looked after them and made sure that they got contracts when they were really in need of funding. And they were many good friends of hers. So music was, I think, something to which she really committed her private life to an insanely large degree because she had nothing else other than music. But I think what she gave to it, she got back in spades in terms of the satisfaction it gave her working on these letters, living, as I say, their lives through their letters. It gave her friendships that she treasured right to the end of her life. And I also think, I mean, and I often think about this when I was writing the book, she's at work all day on this intense, pressured job. Crack this code, you'll save thousands of lives. Don't crack this code, they're all going to die. That's on your head. I mean, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. That is the reality that faced her. The quicker you can crack this code, the more lives we can save. So she has all that pressure. And if it was you or I'm not speaking for myself, Caroline, but if you're doing that all day, you're just going to want to come home. You're just going to want to put a lamb chop on the grill and just sit down and read a book after it. Not so Anderson. Like her thing was, I've done that part of my life. I come home. She ate very frugally throughout her life. She was always whipped thin, because food was just not important. She had to eat because it was fuel, but she really just wanted to get back to her translations. And letters are going left, right, and center to collectors and archives all over the world, which she always include a stamped addressed envelope so they weren't put to any expense to encourage them
Hmm.
back to her. But I think it filled